You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Kinezic.
Welcome back to a very new roundtable episode of the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar, and I'm feeling a little naked in the studio today because I'm running solo. We had a little emergency before the start of the podcast, and Tom is not presently with us. I'm not sure if he's going to be joining us. He may pop in towards the end, or he may not join us at all. So this is a first for the podcast. We're going to kick right into the guests first. I need to make sure I mention we need to thank RJ Comer once again for new music and allowing us to use the song Smothered for our Root It discussion episodes. I think this song fits these episodes perfectly. We're really excited. Thank you, RJ. Make sure you check out his music anywhere you consume or stream your music, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you stream or purchase your music. So really excited about today's episode. We have a great group of people. We have one familiar face, three faces that you don't know. And I thought we would just start off. I have a feeling their personalities are strong enough that I'm just going to be here to referee or moderate. So the collective knowledge in this Zoom is way larger than what I possess. So I'm going to just try to help guide this discussion. But I thought we'd start off by letting each of the guests introduce themselves. Bill, if you could start.
Okay. Good afternoon, Fran. My name is Bill Young. I'm a New York boy, SUNY College of Forestry, Landscape Architecture, and I got a master's out of Pratt Institute. I was working as a common landscape architect, and then I got a job at New York City Sanitation, and I started putting trees on landfills. I met Carl Alderson there. And that launched my career because that said, oh my God, this guy would actually work on a landfill. So my career has been restoring damaged, disturbed, superfunds, brownfields, all the bad lands. And by working on the landfill, I actually got hired by the owner of field operation, James Corner, to teach at University of Pennsylvania. And I've been teaching ecology there for 17 years.
Awesome. And who do you currently work for right now?
Oh, sorry. I work for Sumco Eco Contracting. They actually have bought out the Dawson Corporation. So everyone knows Dawson Corporation is now Sumco Eco Contracting. So we're still out of Jackson, New Jersey.
All right, awesome. Carl, if you could go next.
Hey, Fran.
Hey.
Nice to see everybody today. So I'm Carl Alderson. I grew up on the Jersey Shore. I have a Bachelor of Science from Cook College, formerly Cook College, now the School of Environmental Biological Sciences at Rutgers. And I'm a landscape architect. I started my career really in the design build landscape architecture world. But my real passion was for natural area restoration. So I sought out employment with New York City Parks and their Natural Resources Group back in 1989. And we had a little bit of an oil spill disaster in New York Harbor in 1990. There were 3 successive major oil spills. This was on the heels of the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska. And this precipitated the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And I've been pretty much working on oil pollution cases and Superfund cases for the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, at the federal government level. 18 years now.
Wow.
There. So I've been doing restoration work for about 32 years.
Wow. Fantastic.
Recovery, remediation, and restoration of natural areas.
Wow. Wonderful. All right, Marty, how about you?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting us all to this to the podcast. I've been listening to it, and it's been so great.
Awesome. Thank you.
And really enjoy it, and to be with these esteemed colleagues and friends who I've worked with for a number of years. So my name is Marty Mchugh. I grew up in New Jersey as well. I attended Cook College and Rutgers College. I have a degree in economics and environmental studies, and kind of like the crossroads of what we're going to be talking about today. And I couldn't handle the organic chemistry and all the other heavy science math courses that these guys are really smart about. And so I couldn't become the environmental scientist that I wanted to be. So I ended up going to law school to do environmental work. I guess I really didn't want to be a lawyer so much, but my dad was a lawyer, my grandfather was, I had a bent for it, I guess. And but I knew that was a way for me to do environmental protection work. Okay. So and I was lucky enough to be hired right out of Seton Hall Law School into DEP as an in-house attorney. And I had a very fortunate career there for 25 years. I got meet some great people, work in some great programs. And, I'm a recovering lawyer now. I don't practice law, and I work at Sumco. I'm the regional manager there. I work with Bill, and we do ecological restoration construction. But I did meet Bill and probably Carl and probably Emil on those early spills in the 1990s when we had 1.5 million, I guess, gallons of oil, different kinds of oil spilled in the harbor right after Exxon Valdez. And the silver lining of Valdez and the Exxon Bayway spill in Bayonne was that we had not been doing restoration for natural resource injuries until Exxon Valdez. And then in earnest, the governments, both the states and the feds, got going on doing the programs. And I was involved with the first natural resource damage assessments there in the harbor, working with Carl and a lot of his colleagues and from NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the other states. And then I started the program. I started the program with John Sacco, who is now running it and doing an amazing job. And that's what we really got a good part of the restoration going in the state. Went on to become the director of Fish and Wildlife after a stint with NOAA in the Great Lakes, working with Carl's buddies out there on Great Lakes issues. And then when I left DEP, I went to teach. I loved teaching. Cook College was a great college, and I wanted to give back a little bit. We had some great professors. We all know them. We can talk about those guys later, but got to teach there. So when I left DEP, I went to go teach at Kane University. Then I got called into work on the BP spill, and I stopped teaching after that. I worked on the Louisiana spill with Louisiana and was part of that settlement as well. And then started my own firm and got into restoration of natural resources after, even more so after Sandy came through, and we started doing green infrastructure, nature-based restoration to create resiliency. And we can talk about that. And then fast forward, got to work with the Dawson Corporation, which has now become Sumco. And so it's been a really, really fun career here in New Jersey, and that I get the chance to work with all these guys on the screen too, and Pinelands, which has done so much for that.
And next we have our first return guest. It's been 42 episodes. It's the first time we've had a repeat guest. So Emil, I know you've been on before, but if you could just give a quick reintroduction.
Sure. Well, last time I didn't go into such detail, and these three esteemed gentlemen went into more detail, so I'll do that a little bit now.
All right, awesome.
I was lucky enough to be on Bush campus at Rutgers in the heyday of Rutgers ecology in the late 70s with Ted Stiles and Stuart Pickett and Jim Quinn and Joanna Berger and some of the most incredible scientists that this state has ever been lucky enough to have at our state university. And that's when I pretty much fell in love with the Pine Barrens. Stuart Pickett took me to the Pine Barrens over spring break when I was a sophomore to study mycorrhizal fungi, and that was it. That was the end. And I've never left the Pine Barrens. When I went to Wisconsin to get my PhD, I still did my thesis in the Pine Barrens. And people in Wisconsin thought I was nuts, going back to New Jersey in the summertime of all places. And then after that, I came back here after I got my degree and was a postdoc at Rutgers for 1 year. And then in 1989, started working at New Jersey Conservation Foundation. And that's been it. Been there ever since, doing a variety of things, saving land, stewarding land, dealing with, advocating with legislators and government officials for different practices, better practices, whatever it might be. And I know my name has been taken in vain by people in state government plenty of times, but that's okay. That's it's good if some people take your name in vain and some people praise you. That means you're probably hitting the sweet spot somewhere.
Passionate.
So that's me. I'm familiar with, I studied a lot in the tropics when I was at Wisconsin, had the chance to go to, study on tropical rainforest biology courses, studied all over the United States on different kinds of field trips and research projects in the graduate school there. But mostly I'm a terrestrial forest ecologist, with obviously 30 some odd years of experience in New Jersey.
Awesome. So as we all know, and our guests should know at this point, the topic today for this rooted discussion was the government's role in restoration. And I think what I like about the group we have here today, it's you're kind of covering it from all the sides, all the bases. So we should get a great wealth of opinion on it, and it's something that we're all familiar with because we deal with it every day. Most of our listeners, not all of our listeners, but most of our listeners aren't in the industry. They're homeowners from all walks of life, from all over the country and all over the world. So I don't know that they realize the impact that the government has, both good and bad, in environmental issues. So I wanted to enlighten a lot of our listeners as to what goes on and some of the great work and some of the great projects, what some of the issues may be, but just how far this has come. So I just wanted to throw a few topics out there for discussion, not particular questions, but topics. And I thought there was no better way to start than, does restoration even exist without the government? I don't know who wants to start or where you'd like to start, but I thought I'd throw that one out there. Just, does this exist? Are we even doing this without government intervention right now?
We should start with the government guy.
All right, go ahead.
So I've spent my entire career in either city or federal government. Back when I was at New York City Parks and we were recovering for oil impacts and restoring wetlands that had been impacted by oil spills in the Arthur Kill waterway, this was a fairly new economy. It was hard to explain how it got started exactly. So you have to go back to legislation.
Okay.
If you go back to legislation, you're probably starting with the Clean Water Act in 1972.
All right.
That mandates that we will protect, preserve, restore. It actually says the word restore in the Clean Water Act, our waterways. So that's the foundational piece of legislation.
And that was under Nixon?
Yeah.
Yes.
That was
Richard Nixon signed into law the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act.
Okay.
And the Endangered Species Act.
As well as that one. Yes. I mean, his environmental record just on paper is extraordinary.
Wow.
But I would guess that would not be in the top 10 list of things that Richard Nixon would point to that he was successful at. I think when you go back and look at it, it was a bit of a grassroots effort to bring those things to bear. It was a nation who was tired of suffering under significant amount of pollution in the air and water. And, it was a groundswell, and the legislation really came about through Congress and right on up to the president, who, was fortunately willing to sign off on it, which is astounding. It was completely a bipartisan effort.
A lot of this came out of the first Earth Day. They was, like you said, it was a grassroots effort where they just got everyone involved. I mean, kindergarten kids were involved, and Nixon was the president and said, "Wow, we're losing our Earth here. We got to do something about it." So
yeah, absolutely, Bill. I remember the first Earth Day. I was picking up cans and bottles on the side of the road with all of my friends in elementary school.
I do remember it. It's incredible.
Yeah, to this day, it really informs everything that I do. I think of it as very fundamental to my being. Also, I learned a lot about how people like to throw beer bottles out. And I could name you a half dozen different beer companies in operation in 1970. as a result of our effort there. I think we picked up, we probably picked up about 10 trash barrels of Schlitz and Rheingold.
Yeah, and I have a vivid memory of probably one of the most powerful television commercials of all time. I'm not sure who sponsored the commercial, but all I remember is, this video of horrible chemicals coming out of pipes into rivers and garbage everywhere. And then at the end of the commercial was a Native American chief, with a tear coming out of his eye.
Yeah.
And it was, I was 10 years old, but it was, to this day, it's burned into me, that, it was this freight train that just wasn't going to be stopped. That movement at that time, after DDT and all the horrible rivers on fire. It was just, it was time that something had to happen.
And when you figure how long ago that was, there's still such a disconnect. We're really, as an individual, just starting to reconnect those. The science is starting to catch up. We're starting to realize what's happened, what we've lost. And that's just starting to really catch up to us now, but 50 years later. Right. So it's, 50 years, even with legislation, 50 years has gone by and you're still learning other mistakes that we've made that we have to fix. So I know, Carl, you were just starting to touch on it with that. Is there more that you wanted to add to what you said before everyone else weighs in?
Well, I'll just name one more piece of legislation, and then I'm going to pass it off to the recovering lawyer. So, the next one that came along that impacts my work and really starts to create that economy, like government-fueled economy that is ecological restoration. Okay. I think I would point to CERCLA, or as it's known, Superfund Law in 1980. So that came under the Carter administration and actually was signed into law just before the beginning of the Reagan administration. So that's going back 41 years now. And so what Superfund Law did was it established a regulatory framework for how we would go about first remediating for pollutants, which is under the purview of EPA, and then how we would compensate for the injuries from those pollutants. And that comes under NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the individual state in which the injury occurred, as well as tribes of the United States, if they are, impacted. So from there, I think I'll send it over to Marty to talk about that next big piece of legislation, which was the Oil Pollution Act.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Carl. Thanks for setting up that. All of these laws, and when I was teaching at Rutgers for Professor Goldfarb, another heavyweight who used to teach environmental law at Rutgers, and I before I even start, I just want to say a whole show could be how much conservation and how many people have been trained by Rutgers and the at Cook College. Yeah. And Rutgers University. I lived on Bush campus too, and how much that has impacted the restoration ecology, efforts. It's amazing. It's amazing. Rutgers has a big reach, but all of these laws, like the Oil Pollution Act, which started after it came into being after Exxon Valdez, and the Superfund, a lot of it's based on some New Jersey legislation too. Okay. So for instance, the Spill Compensation and Control Act was written in New Jersey and by some really smart people, Michael Catania and a whole bunch of people that used to work here. Then I think he was an assemblyman or state senator, Florio. I'm pretty sure he was assemblyman. Sponsored that. He went on to Congress, right? And then that's how Superfund started. So there's a real nice connection between New Jersey and a lot of the conservation and environmental protection laws in our country. But the basis of all of these laws that Carl mentioned is something called the Public Trust Doctrine. And that is something that I just recently saw the acting commissioner of DEP, Sean LaTourette, say, this is a very important doctrine. It's a common law doctrine that came from England when we started, when the United States started after the American Revolution. And it's a doctrine that says all of our natural resources are held in trust for the benefit of the public, right? And the trustees of natural resources are the governments that manage these resources. And these resources are not, these natural resources are not the government's resources, they're not owned by the government, they're owned by the people. So there are everybody that's listening to this podcast, there are your resources, right?
Mhm.
And if those resources are injured or damaged by an oil spill or a hazardous waste site under CERCLA, or even a state site that's not managed by
This is where we
the
have
federal
the
government,
gap.
right?
Yeah.
Those resources need to be restored under this law. That is the underpinning of Clean Water Act, Superfund, and the Oil Pollution Act, and some other laws as well. And so we just really, like I said, and like Carl said, after this Valdez spill, we really started in earnest doing that, and going, trying to figure out how do you put a dollar value to an oil duck or an acre of wetland in an area like the New York Harbor, which, by the way, at the time that spill happened on 1990, on January 31st, actually 1989, maybe 1990, early in the morning on New Year's Eve, I wouldn't say we had written off the harbor, but we weren't believing, a lot of the agencies were focused elsewhere, and the harbor was not thought to be a great, an important habitat. And correct me if I'm wrong, Emil, or, it was birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, but we really found out how important the habitats in the harbor were for our natural resources when those spills happened and we started seeing the impacts. And that the day that I went out there to look at the spill was the day that I met, and it was his first day on the job, was Andy Wilner, who was the baykeeper.
Okay.
And, I met him on the Elizabeth Bar. So all of these laws have an underpinning of the public trust doctrine. And the Commissioner of DEP right now, he really believes truly in that. And it's really nice to see. So we're very fortunate to have those laws, and it's really driving restoration, not just in New Jersey, but across the country, and has been. I mean, look what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon spill.
So I'm going to throw this over to Emil, but I'm going to kind of add in a subtopic that I thought of as we were kind of going through this. So Emil, working with government agencies, but working for an NGO, I'm curious your take on this, but also with any laws or legislations over time, loopholes can be found or ways around it can be found. Working for an NGO, do you find in some ways the laws are too strict, or some ways their laws are too soft, that there's too much wiggle room or not enough wiggle room where things can't get done that could get done? I'm just curious of your take, how you feel about this topic.
Well, as far as your second question, there's examples of that in both directions.
Yeah.
In some cases, you're hamstrung by regulations that don't let you do the easiest path toward restoration. In other cases, the regulations aren't strong enough because sometimes restorations or other kind of work gets done, and it really, like the one thing that bugs me sometimes is that monitoring requirements usually sunset after like 5 years, and then 10, 15, 20 years down the road, these things take a long time to really, for you to know if they're really going to work. But aside from that, without government, I mean, there'd be nothing. Even the biggest NGOs depend on government grants to do these various important stewardship projects. And in New Jersey, in particular in New Jersey, most of, the large non-government organizations that buy land, the county park systems, the municipal park systems, all the state lands have, if it wasn't for the Green Acres program, which has been billions of dollars since the 1960s to buy land, and now Green Acres is also giving out stewardship grants. There would be only a whisper of what we're actually doing in terms of the land that we've saved, that even if we haven't gotten around to restoring it yet, we can restore it in the future. The restoration projects that we've done, for example, there are dam removal projects that Nature Conservancy has accomplished in New Jersey with many other nonprofits. You couldn't even name them all.
Yeah,
it would take too long. But that money comes from a whole potpourri of government and non-government sources. But it's the government sources that make usually provide the match. You know, if for example, you know, at our wetlands restoration at the Franklin Parker Reserve, we restored 1,000 acres of, you know, hard packed, modernized cranberry bogs that, you know, had basically nothing living in them to these fabulous wetlands. And, you know, the money came from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and, you know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a bunch of foundations kicked in money, but, you know, because they saw these other matching monies coming in from the government. So, and of course, just acquiring the land itself, you know, we were able to purchase, it's up to almost 14,000 acres now. And we've probably spent about, I'm going to guess and say about $15 million purchasing that land. But probably 5 million of it has come from the Green Acres program.
Okay.
So, you know, in order to get the land, in order to store the land, you know, the government is absolutely essential. Even if it's, you know, full or partial funding, that helps you convince other funders that, you know, they're going to kick their money in, other donors for, you know, private donations. When they see those partnerships forming, you know, that's how you put the money together to get the job done. And if there wasn't a strong government commitment at all levels, whether it's municipal, county, state, federal, you know, we wouldn't be anywhere. I mean, so don't kid yourself. The NGOs couldn't possibly do this without the government.
Well, you know, it's funny because that was kind of leading me to my next question. I was going to throw this to Bill, just kind of being on the periphery of both. Can NGO restorations exist without government, and can government restorations exist without NGOs? Is that a partnership that without one or the other one falters?
Oh, I think you should ask Emil that. All I know is government
be open
drives
to
everything.
Yeah.
Government, when I look at the work that I do, and we're the contractors, right? Marty and I, we're the contractors. So we're on the back end when all the legislation and all these laws and all the enforcement is done, we get to do the restoration. I can't think of any of it that's not government funded. When you look at it, we bid work and we get paid to do work, and it has to come from some budget. But I love the whole damage assessment thing because it basically entitles the U.S. to healthy ecosystems. And if a company like BP comes in and has a spill, they owe the public to restore that. And the attorneys have actually negotiated and said to get the Gulf of Mexico back to where it was, you have to pay these damages. And for the Gulf of Mexico, it was the BP oil spill was 19 billion. And much of that goes into ecological restoration. So that's a great driver for a ton of work.
Yeah, so the government, you know, so there's different programs. Of course, the natural resource damage program is near and dear to our hearts. And but, you know, all of these regulations that Emil and Carl and Bill have been dealing with for all their careers, you know, they're structured in a way that, you know, creates a driver for restoration, right? And even in the context of where we're, you know, government doesn't have endless amounts of money to do this. So we're taking private funds, right, where compensation is required under the damage assessment program, or if there's an environmental violation and somebody does a project for a supplemental environmental project, you know, under that program, instead of paying their full fine. All of these things are driven by state or federal laws, and they're super important for this whole restoration industry. Even in the context of where we're trying to drive private capital into restoration. So you're aware of wetlands banking, right? So it's a very expensive proposition to try to set up a wetlands bank. You know, a private company comes in and has to buy land and then go through the permitting process and put up funds, performance bonds, and everything, and then they have to negotiate with the government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and the state, figure out how many credits they could make, and then they got it. Then they come in and they restore ahead of any damage, and then people can buy credits. Even when we're driving private capital into restoration, it's all, you know, goes back to whatever the federal or state law that requires that restoration, right?
No net loss. We have to replace wetlands.
Yeah.
No net loss. Yeah.
Mitigation
but-
banking is going to be that could be a whole nother
That's a whole nother,
conversation.
that's a whole nother conversation.
You know,
But-
and
But
kind
don't
of what,
forget, but don't forget, every one of those laws, whether it's the Pinelands Protection Act, or the Freshwater Wetlands Act, the Clean Water Act, those happen because of people pushing and advocating. There would be no Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge if it wasn't for Helen Fenske, for example. There would be no Pinelands Protection Act if it wasn't for Brooks and Dot Everett and, Brendan Byrne and a handful of other people. I mean, and I'm sure every state in the country, whatever they have, it had to start with a bunch of people sitting around, at their kitchen table complaining about something and trying to figure out what could be done. And then, of course, a legislator recognizing that something needed to be done and figuring out how to turn that advocacy into, something in a state house or in Congress. But if you just look at the history of every one of these things, it's individual people teaming with NGOs and attorneys and legislators and other knowledgeable people. I mean, we were lucky in New Jersey to have like the folks that Marty was mentioning earlier, writing some of those early, drafts of early legislation and that type of thing. But, and I think it's a little harder now. I think it's a little bit harder now for a small group of people to push for legislative change than it used to be. I don't think that channel of communication is what it used to be. Although, hopefully that'll come back, with some of the pressing issues of the day. But with climate change and that kind of thing, it's going to have to come from the people, because there's just there's so much to overcome, and we're just going to have to. It's just got to come from the people, in my view.
well, we know corporations will advocate for themselves. They'll put out large amounts of money to advocate for themselves. Not, and not to paint that in an evil way. We had CWRP on to talk about all these corporations that band together that help NGOs and help match and do all these wonderful things. So not to paint corporations as the devil, but so many of the guests that we've had on the show and all these great organizations all started around a table. The Xerces Society and so many of these other ones started as grassroots efforts. And we do see it here on a local level. And I know we mentioned we had our local watershed on and because they did away with the environmental committee at a local level and the pressure to build more warehouses and things like that. But it's an uphill battle. It's a small group against much larger groups. And I understand what they're going against. But both the government and these NGOs work together for such great purposes. And we've seen the amount of work that gets done. But there are limitations. And I know, Marty, you mentioned, funds. I was curious, what are some of the government's limitations for progressing forward with restorations where we've been and where we need to go? What are some of the limitations the government has as far as taking this to the next step?
Well, you make a very good point too, by the way. Before I answer the question, things are different than they were when I first started in 1985. The regulated community, corporations, and all the companies that are regulated by the states and the feds, there's been a major sea change since then, and they've really, most people, most companies are in compliance. When they have a problem, they step up and it's rare these days that we have to kind of litigate these things or really force things. I mean, there's still enforcement, but they're really, especially coming together at the New Jersey Corporate Wetlands Restoration Partnership and funding all that restoration. So, and there's a whole, movement within corporate, management for environmental social governance within each, within all the corporate stakeholders and shareholders want to see sustainability and environmental protection. So we're very fortunate in that respect. It's just that I think the problems now are so much more complicated to deal with in terms of restoration. We've kind of got all the low-hanging fruit, the cleanups and the big spills are kind of hopefully under control and the sites are getting cleaned up. But now these things like greenhouse gases and PFAS and all this other stuff is more difficult. So the government's limitation is there's a number of limitations, I think, and a lot of it's people. Like when I started in '85, DEP had 4,000 people, right? And the regulations that we dealt with were like in volumes this big. Now we have less than 2,000, I think, and the regulations are farther than my arms can hold out. And it's very complicated, right? And so there's not, and a lot of us that I started my cohort, they're all retiring. So you have this big brain drain going out of all these agencies right now. And we have really good young people coming up. In fact, Bill and I are working with a group from Kane right now, super smart kids, and it's good. But that institutional knowledge that loss is a problem. And then in terms of all of these complicated problems, the more difficult ones that we got to deal with, the laws were written back in the 70s, like we talked about, right? So the nails that we were hitting in the 70s were, 1980s, 1970 nails. Now the problems are 2021, right? And sometimes the regulations and the laws don't match up with the new problems. But then when you go to open a law to fix it or to enhance it or to, bring it up to date, that's a little dangerous sometimes, because then all these interests come in and they try to change things. And it's really kind of, sometimes it gets to be a free-for-all. Like I was involved with the reauthorization of OPA in 1995, and I did work on the Hill, and I testified before subcommittees for that and for the circular reauthorization. And we almost lost the authorities to do natural resource damage assessment.
Wow.
But a whole group of people banded together to do, to keep those authorities intact. A lot of people that Carl worked with and that Emil worked with and Bill worked with, a lot of smart people, and we were able to do that. But so we have these laws that were written many years ago and regulations that were written, but we have these new modern problems that don't always match up with the laws.
Right.
You have a great point, and I'm going to throw this to Carl too, if you want to elaborate on that. But the one thing that I was thinking about, actually, as you were talking about this, with how many people there are and what they're dealing with, and I know as you go from administration to administration, there are changes made. They may get changed one way, back another. You're dealing with budgets, and you have the public divided. If you want more government or less government, how stretched are we right now? For what we need to accomplish, how hard is it to accomplish this, just from an internal standpoint with staffing or budgets?
Yeah, well, we mentioned all those very important early pieces of legislation, but as time passes, there is, of course, less and less attention paid to, say, Superfund Law still exists, but the as the name implies, it had there was a fund created, but that fund was allowed to drain and not really be replenished in order to really address all of the different injuries, especially states like New Jersey, where there was an extraordinary amount of industry and an extraordinary amount of injury from those from pollution, unchecked pollution. We can talk about the remaining amount of PCBs, a really dangerous chemical that's in the environment that was released large and small areas throughout the state, or dioxin in the Passaic River. Look, we are strapped for not only a number of people working on these cases, but for talent coming out of the universities. Why are we strapped? The talent's there in the universities. Well, because oftentimes there's just no room for hiring. Whether there's hiring freezes at the federal level or at the state level, it always seems like we're just competing for funding resources with a whole host of other issues that both state and federal government have to deal with. And also, those pieces of legislation dealt with, our grandfathers' issues, in the day when, grandpa and dad were working in factories and making a good coin at their factory jobs. Some of these companies were also, releasing pollutants unchecked. So we're still dealing with those legacy contaminants, but we have a whole host of new issues that have come forward. And you think about pharmaceuticals, or you think about PFOA or PFOS, shorthand for a couple of man-made chemicals that are released that have to do with non-stick substances like Teflon, what's on Teflon pans, right?
Yeah.
Those are systemic throughout the environment now. So we've got a whole host of new things. And I would point to climate change as being the most recent of those. And of course, legislation is coming along to address that issue. We didn't have climate change legislation when we started, when Bill and Marty and Emil started. So I point to just a recent one, piece of legislation that I think is going to be very effective. It just did here in New Jersey. Only 2 weeks ago, on February 4th, Governor Murphy signed into law Senate Bill 2607, I believe it was. If anyone of your listeners wants to look that up, 2607.
Okay.
Senate Bill 2607. Now, what does that do? That bill finally will address climate change on the municipal level. And we all know that in New Jersey, we have a thing called home rule, where all of the 500 plus municipalities really have an important role in addressing whatever issue the state has, right? So this bill will finally require each municipality in their master plan to address climate change, really for the first time. You think about master planning and how essential that is for each municipality to put forward that master plan to the state every 5 years or so. Now, when you put forward your housing plan for your municipality, you have to identify issues that will affect housing and climate change, and on, whether it's utilities or it's recreation or it's stormwater discharge or transportation. You must address what the potential climate impacts will be. That's new. It's 2 weeks old. It's a newborn piece of legislation, and it was bipartisan. So to address the question about, whether or not we can all agree on in a nonpartisan way on getting things done. Yes, we can. I think that bill right here in the state proves that we can come together and address these issues that are so impactful.
And I'm sure some of the areas that you get pulled into or some of the other factors aren't necessarily even environmental factors. When you have things like COVID going on, you have to shift gears, or if we're in a time of war, money gets allocated in different ways. And I know, Emil, you could probably, as far as, through New Jersey, if you could probably go through each governor, and if the environment was more important to this governor or less important to that governor and what it meant. Is it that hard to shift gears as you change through this throughout time, where it becomes more important, less important, or there's other important issues that take precedent over what we're doing?
Well, we've been pretty lucky in New Jersey. I mean, of course, I only can go think back to the 80s, and Governor Byrne passed the Pinelands Protection Act, and there's other acts, but Democratic Governor Byrne passed the Pinelands Protection Act. Republican Governor Tom Kean passed the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act, which is stronger than the federal act. And we still use in New Jersey the proper wetlands definition, which was weakened under the first George Bush for the federal government. So we still actually use the proper wetlands definition, where most of the country doesn't. Almost all of the country doesn't.
Okay.
If New Jersey had weakened its wetlands law the way the federal government did, we'd have lost approximately 2/3 of all of our wetlands by definition.
Wow.
And it was actually Governor Whitman who commissioned that study, because Governor Whitman was present, and we were worried about what would happen to our wetlands law. And I actually toured Governor Whitman's farm and showed her what would be wetlands and what wouldn't be wetlands.
Okay.
You know,
And that's a powerful statement right there.
right? And so we were able to hold on to our wetland definition in New Jersey. Governor Whitman, Republican governor, you know, pushed forward huge amounts of money toward green acres. You know,
About
she
the
got a
Million
program
Acre
called
Initiative.
2 million acres or something. I can't remember the exact words, but you know, and billions of dollars were added to the Green Acres program to acquire, you know, conservation lands. Let's see, who was governor next? Boy, well, Governor Florio was in there for a little while, and of course maintained the, you know, funding for the Superfund in New Jersey and Green Acres funding. I'm trying to remember who was governor after Governor Whitman. Governor McGreevey passed the Highlands Act, the Highlands Preservation Act.
Okay.
And that was a Democratic governor. And then let's see. Also, let's see, when did Reggie pass the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? That may have been, Governor Corzine, perhaps. Somebody help me out. And then Governor Christie, I believe it was under Governor Christie when a stable source of funding for land acquisition was finally passed. And then, and now under Governor Murphy, we've, you know, made some significant strides against climate change and the Global Warming Response Act. And, you know, so we're pretty lucky in New Jersey. We've had bipartisan support. I'm not going to say that everybody was perfect. They weren't. But we've been pretty lucky in that some of the big issues of the day, the advocates, the NGOs, and there's a slew of them, right? There's all the watershed associations and the regional nonprofits and the statewide nonprofits. You know what Marty mentioned, Andy Wiltner and the Baykeeper. You know, we have Baykeepers and River Keepers and watershed associations and, you know, the various conservancies and land trusts. I mean, it forms a pretty formidable group, you know, so we're usually pretty good at getting some of the most important things to happen. Sometimes, you know, we don't. Sometimes, you know, we think a few things fall short. But for the most part, we've been pretty lucky in New Jersey in that things haven't been weakened like they have around the rest of the country. So I go places and I see wetlands being filled and destroyed. And I'm like, how they could never do that in New Jersey, you know, because we still define wetlands properly. In many places, you know, there's no wetlands buffers. The wetland definition is weak. Swamps are being filled. They're not even called wetlands. It's crazy what happens around the country. So
yeah, I know we have property here that originally when Don purchased it, it wasn't wetlands, but by the time we decided to look at it, it was redelineated as wetlands. So it's which is fine with us. That's, you know, that's not an issue. But we keep touching on some of these great accomplishments, and we can go into some of it if you want, but I kind of want to throw this to Bill in a different direction. You know, when you think of federal accomplishments without government, you have national parks, the Clean Water Act, Oil Pollution Act, National Environmental Policy Act. Locally, in New Jersey, New York, you have the New York City Million Tree Program, New Jersey Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act, Pineland Protection Act. You know, and personally, Pinelands Nursery doesn't exist without the Pinelands Protection Act or the Clean Water Act. Like, without that,
of course not.
We don't exist. So with all these restorations, it kind of created a whole business, or not a business, but a whole industry. And I think a lot of us are here. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for what the government was able to accomplish. So, Bill, I'm curious, and I know you kind of threw some stuff at us before this started. Do you feel that we underestimate the importance, the economic importance of restoration?
I do. And only when this came up as a subject and we all looked into it a little bit, did I realize I'm trying to look at all the work that we do that's not related to government, not government funded. And it was very little. Very few people say, let's restore this Superfund site out of pocket. We're just going to do it out of the kindness of our heart. It's driven by regulations and it's required by government, and all the stuff that we've been talking about leads to an amazing field that's really growing in restoration. And the thing is, friend, restoration is really good. It's not like it's money being spent. It generates a whole economy. We've done restoration jobs where, it's a lot of jobs. It puts money back into the economy. Every pizza place and deli in town is filled, when we're doing all this restoration. So it's a generator. If I could read this a little bit about the Everglades Restoration Project, if you'll bear with me.
Yes, go
Projections
ahead.
show that investing $11.5 billion in Everglades restoration will result in $46.5 billion in gains to Florida's economy and create more than 440,000 jobs over the next 50 years. For every dollar invested in Everglades restoration, $4 are generated in economic benefits.
And I know this is something that, and I know you commented after the episode that we had Dr. Sala on with the research in the fishing industry, that they learned that they could make more money preserving the waters off of tourism, and it actually improved fishing than just to let the fishermen gut it. So, and that's a hard role to take to get people to realize that hey, it's more it's more if we protect it and go less. And even as we achieve this higher consciousness and all the studies are there, the restoration doesn't seem to stop. It seems like there's more and not less. So this is an industry that just keeps getting larger and larger. I don't see it tapering off or getting smaller. I don't know how everyone else feels about that.
Well, I was on a webinar. I guess it wasn't a webinar as much as it was a public hearing about Liberty State Park.
Okay.
Here we are in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. A huge restoration project is about to be undertaken on, some area that was tainted with chromium and other things. And the people that were, they were giving people only a few seconds to speak because there were so many members of the public that wanted to comment on how they needed that restoration, not just because, they wanted Liberty State Park to be a little bit nicer. It's already beautiful, but they needed that restoration because if it wasn't for the outdoors in these urban areas, especially during this last year, these poor people would have had no place to go for any kind of peace of mind. Our parks have been mobbed. The visitation at our preserves has skyrocketed in the last year. We've had to deal with parking problems and, figuring out innovative ways to, keep people to be able to come, but not be too close together. And the state has some of the large state parks, initially they had to shut down until they figured out what to do, because it was so important to have places where people could go and, rehabilitate themselves, given the massive strains that were being put on everybody's psyche, and it's continuing. The other thing, I know, Marty, you might want to comment. I know you're involved in that massive project. I believe you're involved, right, in that massive project at the Harrison Avenue landfill in
Right.
Camden.
By the way, and I'm glad you brought up the Liberty State Park and even the Camden project. Fran, those projects are being funded by the natural resource damage assessment funds that were collected in compensation for other, for impacts. So again, there you have the connection. And
that Camden project is important just for its location as well. That
area
needs that.
Bill's been all over it, so I'll let him talk about it, but I'll just introduce it a second. And so that was a landfill that was, not properly closed and, shut down in the 70s. And it was basically an eyesore and actually maybe a public health issue as well. And it's right on the confluence of, or it's right on the Delaware River where the confluence, where the Cooper River comes in. So they're transforming that into a park right now, and it's an amazing situation. And it was a big undertaking by the state to fund that to the tune of something like $30 or $40 million of natural resource damage funds, and 380,000 plants are going in there, living shorelines and all this. And I'll turn it over to Bill to talk about it. But the same thing is happening at Liberty State Park, and the connection between the economy and the environment is so clear in these places, especially in the urban settings, where it generates. In Philadelphia, the green infrastructure program is generating billions of dollars a year in the economy, in this green infrastructure industry that is now, and it's improving people's property values, and it's improving water quality. And all these things have a value to them when you start putting dollar values to natural resource services. Like for instance, when I was at, I have the sheet here, when I was at Fish and Wildlife, running Fish and Wildlife, we put a sheet together, and I know this is out of date, but fishing and hunting and wildlife watching generates a 4 billion back then, right? Generated $4 billion to the state economy. Wow. So there's, it very, and that's what won the day when we were arguing about Superfund and OPA, Oil Pollution Act reauthorization. We told them it's not about hugging trees and bugs and bunnies. It's about jobs. It's about people's livelihoods, and it's about quality of life. And that won the day, and it still will win the day, and it still is. But Bill, do you want to talk about
Before Bill talks about that, I just want to mention, I hope that someone is out there knowledgeable enough to do a study on how having open space has impacted people's health during this crisis, because that is going to be an astronomical number in terms of, people avoiding having mental health issues and other kinds of social problems that result from being cooped up and not having money coming in and that type of thing. I mean, I'm sure that the fact that there's been such good access to open space and places to go in New Jersey where you can walk, and get to some place pretty easily with your family and that kind of thing. I mean, the urban parks, the suburban parks, they've been jammed. And most of every one of those has happened because of Green Acres funding in the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah,
improvements to all those places. That's got to be an astronomical number of problems that have been avoided because we have a plethora of open space.
I'll be honest. 2020 was it was a difficult year for everyone, and it was a difficult year for me in many ways, even going beyond COVID-19. It was an extremely difficult year, and our open spaces were the one thing that helped me really get through it. Me and my fiance and my family, because that's how we spent all of our family time and all our weekends. And that reconnection really helped with this podcast as well, and the love for what I do and my job. Without that, it would have been a completely different year for me. And that's just me. I can't imagine how many other people have extremely similar stories to that.
And further to what Emil said, and Marty, like Harrison Avenue, Landfill, and other open spaces, not just mental health. What about the giant sponge of these acres that when there's flooding and storm surge, there's a green place for it to go and to be collected and not flood our homes?
Yeah.
Our dunes and our beaches do such an amazing job, and we take it for granted. But when you pave things over, you see how bad it is. So Harrison Avenue Landfill went from the worst thing in the neighborhood, in one of the worst places in Camden, to this gem. It's right on the river. There's bald eagles there in the island that's right next to it. Tons of jobs were created. There's a whole center there where they have cultural center and they have dancing and amphitheaters. It's amazing. And guess what? Already the real estate is improving in the Kramer Hill area. It is now, instead of this dump, it is now Kramer Hill Regional Park. There's going to be transportation and buses going by and families using the playgrounds and the kayak channels and all of that. But the living shorelines are helping us with flooding and other green infrastructure things that really help our cities.
Yeah, there was another project outside, or get out of New Jersey for a minute, in Wilmington called the South Wilmington Wetlands Park. If anybody's interested in Googling that, we worked on that with a company called Diamond Materials, and the city of Wilmington did a great job of taking a brownfield that was in an area that was flooding in an urban community where people were living and there were businesses, and we turned that into a park, a wetlands park that is actually going to absorb this flooding much better, and it's not going to result in people's getting combined sewage overflow in their basements anymore. So same thing up at Harrison. And what's interesting, and I'll just throw this out, it's creating a new constituency for the support of conservation, I think, and restoration. Because like when I was at Fish and Wildlife, we had our hunters, our anglers, the paddlers, the hikers, the birders. Everybody was supportive of natural resource conservation and restoration. But now with climate, right, change, and people are starting to see that if we restore their town's shoreline and their streams and make the water convey better and the wetlands absorb the storm waters better, people who are not really weren't that interested in natural resources at that time are now becoming aware of the importance of these systems, and now they're going to be supporting conservation and restoration into the future. And it's really cool, and that's what really gets us jazzed about it.
You mentioned before the Liberty State Park project that is now in design, and that is going to help us to open up an area that's been behind a rusty fence for decades, that is contaminated. When it is remediated, and then when the area is restored to woodlands and wetlands, freshwater ponds, and recreation trails, Jersey City will have access to some 240 more acres, not just of open space, but of actual, what we could call wildlands, right? There'll be forest and meadows, as opposed to necessarily a lot of recreational ball fields. There's going to be some component of it that will be that as well. But
and wildlife comes right back, Carl. Like, the wildlife is like, they don't read the papers. They are so desperate for habitat. We restore these areas, and like the next day they're there.
If you build it, right?
Right.
If you build it, they will come.
Exactly. And I just want to mention that this, again, about legislation, what makes this possible is the Water Resources Development Act, which gives the Army Corps authority to work with the state of New Jersey. New Jersey provides the natural resource damage funds, right? Marty, you mentioned that. Army Corps is able to utilize those funds under their program, and then they require an additional federal partner under the Water Resource Development Act to act as the partner for the state. So the Army Corps can't act as the partner while it's accepting the funds to do the work. So NOAA actually became the federal partner for that project. So I'm involved in it as well in a review capacity, a technical advisor capacity. But what I really enjoyed finding out was I did a study of how this will impact Jersey City's access to natural resources. And what I learned through this little GIS study that I did is that when that 240 acres does become open and accessible again, it will literally double the amount of wildlands in Jersey City.
Wow.
Yeah. And the other wildlands that are currently available to Jersey City residents are largely from past mitigation and restoration projects. You have the Lincoln Park West project, which contributed 42 acres of wetlands and grasslands and trails. And then there's also the Chromium site over in Liberty State Park currently, which is I believe some 80 acres or so of restored wetlands there. So when you take all of it together, remarkably, this is going to have a tremendous impact for and a beneficial one for the residents of Jersey City. And I will say, regionally, because Liberty State Park is a regional park. So you take all of Hudson County, and this is going to have a significant, increase to all of Hudson County's access to wildlands.
And these are areas that really need this. They need this, and no one even really touched on how it improves our water quality, or it improves the erosion problems in that area just by creating that, especially in those locations. I have we have about a half an hour left, and there's still 3 topics I want to cover. And the funny thing is, we kind of just touched on all 3 of them within the last conversation. So I don't know that it matters which one I start with, but Carl just brought up Army Corps of Engineers, and we've kind of mentioned them throughout. How important is the Army Corps of Engineers, and what's the importance of what they do for restoration?
Well, first off, they have a boatload of engineers, which is implied in their name.
Literally.
As a landscape architect, I like to think that the services that my profession can provide is is additive to what what civil engineers do, right? While they're doing the calculations and the mathematics to tell us what the volumes are for any amount of earth moving, and what and hydrologists at the Army Corps add a lot too as well. So when you're building wetlands, you want to ensure that you have the proper hydrology, the amount of water, where the water flows. So they bring those kinds of services where they can do the modeling for the hydrological modeling. Now, a landscape architect adds an extra dimension. We also have those capabilities of doing quantitative calculations, but we also bring in that biological. Bill and I, trained landscape architects, know our plant material very well, and we know what plant material makes sense in what places and where. We understand the necessity and the importance of bringing in local genotypes, that being plants that are appropriate to that particular region. And we understand what their culturing needs are. We understand what the soil requirements have to be and the nutrient requirements. And so that's what we bring to the table. And so I think the Army Corps of Engineers largely has, for us, enormous capabilities in doing kind of the underlying big picture calculations and getting soil moved from here and there, because our business is a lot about where you're moving things to. So soil in, soil out. Yeah. Bad soil out, good, quality soils in.
Can I add a plug? Can I add a plug about the EPA?
Sure, please.
EPA used to be an enforcement agency, and you can't do this, and you're fined or whatever. And then wait a minute, maybe we should take a proactive role. And the EPA is leading in innovative ways and putting on workshops to help people be compliant. Instead of fining them, they guide and teach. And EPA has been so proactive in making this a better situation.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I want to throw in something for the Corps too. So the Corps, has been maligned in the past for, channelizing rivers and hardening, shorelines and things like that. But they were doing that because that was the way we did things back then. That's the way engineers were taught.
And that was the will of the people. That's what the people wanted. Yeah.
And that's what the people want. Now with WRDA and and I noticed this after Hurricane Sandy, especially because what happened after Hurricane Sandy was really transformative as well. It's kind of like the oil spill got us into natural resource dam, really got us into the idea of green infrastructure and nature-based restoration. And right after Sandy, I was contacted by a friend who was in the DC area in the Corps, and she said, "Hey, we're going to fly in into the Army camp at Seagirt, and we know you're in Manasquan area. Could you take us around Manasquan and show us what happened and tell us what you think?" Because I started working on green infrastructure with the Conservation Fund at the time. What you think would be good green infrastructure restoration opportunities in your town, which is kind of a microcosm for a lot of the coastal towns. And Emil saw Emil came down to Manasquan and saw the devastation and helped us with a lot of folks down there that were, needed help at the time. And so they flew in, and I thought it was just going to be some lower level guy. They flew in the commander of the Corps, right? Wow. In a Black Hawk helicopter. And I took him around with the town council and we showed him what to do. And you know what? Now they have, and they were already starting this, but they have a nature-based program at, I think it's called ERDIC. I don't know what it stands for, but an Engineering Research and Development Center. And they're really, really working hard to innovate new ways to deal with coastal resiliency and restoration associated with that. Some hard structures and some soft stuff. So we got to give kudos to the Corps. And now they're also looking at dredge material as not as a waste to be disposed of, but also to be used beneficially to build up our wetlands that are sinking, that are being inundated. And then we're coming in and planting them, right? So, the Corps is really important right now for this.
Yeah, we've seen that at Poplar Island down in Maryland, rebuilding that whole
Right.
to an incredible, it's not a true restoration, but just the incredible ecosystem they're creating there is phenomenal. I kind of want to, we've done a really good job at kind of doing the past and the present.
Wait,
And-
before you do that, Fran, why did
Yeah.
you say that something's not a true restoration? Well, I didn't know what
But
you mean.
it was they're making it salt marsh, and even though the original Poplar Island had salt marsh, it wasn't all salt marsh. It was a pine island, and it's pretty much all salt marsh now with the way it's being recreated. So it's
Well, because they're
went from-
predicting that because of sea level rise, they're going to need more salt marsh.
Yeah, it was originally 1,000 acres that eroded down to 15 acres, and they're rebuilding it as a 20-year project in 20 phases of rebuilding that island. But it's not going to look the same as it did before. It's
what?
on a different structure. No, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Just saying that it's different.
Yeah.
And
By the
Jamaica
way-
Bay, Carl, how many acres of Jamaica Bay were restored?
Right.
These islands were
Yeah.
shrunk down to nothing.
Right. I mean, salt marsh is going to be one of the habitats that we have, we're going to end up losing the most of in the next, 50 to 100 years.
Yeah.
So if we're restoring salt marsh, just
Excellent.
because it wasn't salt marsh before, that doesn't mean anything. I mean,
That's right.
we have to, look 75 years out now when we try to think of, what we're going to build.
By the
Because-
way, before you move on, Fran, just,
Yeah, sure.
and you can't leave out NOAA. NOAA has innovated so many different restoration approaches, and they got into the whole, resiliency and, natural resource damage restoration early on. And there's a lot of good work coming out of NOAA. They're one of the more nimble federal agencies. They really jump on a thing when something happens. And, we're lucky to have Carl here and all those good people at NOAA working with the Corps, because it really takes like a layer cake. This is what the Conservation Fund used to say, a layer cake of people to make these projects happen.
Yeah.
And then a layer cake of funding to line up to do all these projects.
Exactly.
And without people, without partners and it's relationships. It's like, we know Carl, we know Emil, we know people in other states, and when they get to know each other, then they work together better. And without all these agencies layer caking this funding and layer caking their expertise, none of this stuff would happen.
No, and I
That's a nice plug from Marty. And Marty, let me tell you,
hey.
I had knee surgery from a basketball injury just so I could stay nimble.
There you go.
Light on my feet, man. Right.
But and here you have from all different industries, everyone that's worked together and communicated well together. I can't speak for any other states, but it seems the communication in New Jersey is fantastic between cross industries and NGOs and so forth. I love the fact that how well you each know each other, and you're friends outside of work as well, which is amazing. So, one of the places I wanted to go was where we need to go in the future. And when Emil was on the podcast last, he mentioned.
You gotta stop there for a second, because when you say we're friends outside of work, let me say it's not easy. Bill's a Yankee fan. I don't know how we managed to stay friends. I mean,
Yeah,
We are
Emil and I
brothers.
are Mets fans.
We're all brothers, Fran.
Yeah. Emil, when you were on the podcast last time, you mentioned carbon credits, and we kind of tabled that. Maybe this is the place to bring that back up, where you're saying that the government should issue carbon credits. And I just wanted to throw that topic out there and let everyone kind of discuss that.
Well, let me just lead that, because
Okay.
there's a fellow in the Bureau of Forestry in New Jersey who's one of the smartest guys I know. His name is Bill Zipsey, and he works for John Sacco, who's been mentioned a bunch of times today. And he knows all about this stuff, and he wants to figure out how to, do the setup work so that we could have carbon markets to protect our forests in New Jersey. And it's a difficult task. But the thing that's astounding is, and I don't know, this might be data from a couple of years ago, but the state of Maine, right?
Mhm.
The state of Maine basks in the sun all year, and the trees, sequester carbon. Well, they harvest as much carbon as they sequester. Their net carbon game in the state of Maine is 0, right? They harvest 1 to 1 as much as the trees photosynthesize. In New Jersey, it's 7-1. And we're losing forests to development. We're losing forests to, land use conversion. And yet, because of the fact that we don't just, have a paper industry in New Jersey or whatever, and our forests are now, I've been measuring a lot of the trees in some of our forests in the New Jersey Highlands, and some of them are 150 years old, some of them are 120 years old, and they're growing like crazy. They're sequestering carbon as fast as they ever did, if not faster, because of the warmer temperatures and the extra rainfall. And so in New Jersey, we're sequestering 7 times more carbon than we are taking away by either forestry practices or land conversion. So there's a tremendous potential there, right? For both all of the land that we've set aside for Green Acres, with Green Acres money, these billions of dollars buying all these forests for the last 60 years, none of them are actually protected, right? Anybody can still go and get a permit to clear cut anything in New Jersey, except our few tiny little natural areas, which are practically non-existent.
And wetlands.
And so there's tremendous potential there for New Jersey to bring money into the state to do all these other restoration projects if we can set up a carbon market. And Bill wants to do it. And it's just another one of these tasks that, like Marty and others talked about before, we don't have the personnel. We need to collect more data. We need to figure out, what are all the forests actually doing? The data needs to be much more specific. And then private landowners could reap the benefits of that too. So that's a huge issue that we need to tackle. Some states are starting to do it. New Jersey's behind on that, but we have tremendous potential. And I don't know much about it, how you go about calculating it, but I do know that we need to figure it out.
Yeah, and I agree. And again, this is another way to bring private capital into the arena to do restoration and preservation and conservation as well. But there's a lot of really smart folks that are looking at this. And in fact, there's even farming practices and ways that you can work on the soils where the soils can sequester carbon as well.
There's actually a greater potential there.
Right. I mean, if you did that across the Midwest, you might even be able to reverse things, in terms of climate change, from what I've been hearing and reading.
If we can turn farms from dirt back to soil, basically.
Right. Exactly.
And the other benefit of that is that the pollination crisis, we could go a long way towards solving the pollinator crisis by having a living soil instead of, these chemical laden dirt farms.
Right.
Right. There are some chemicals out there that are probably worse than DDT that we're not addressing right now.
So
especially neonicotinoids, which could be, one of the biggest problems anywhere right now around the world. Many countries have banned them and we haven't addressed them yet.
NOAA is looking at the potential for blue carbon programs. What's blue carbon? But that's carbon that can be sequestered in the marine environment. But the carbon cycle is very complicated. One of the things we can do in the marine environment is try to invest in bringing back submerged aquatic vegetation into our bays. Barnegat Bay, Delaware Bay, Raritan Bay, all were places where there was extensive beds of seagrass. And those sequester carbon because because of their root zones, right? They're herbaceous material. They die off in the winter. So there's some net export of carbon out of the desiccating leaves when those die off in the cold weather, right? But then as in the growing season, they are removing carbon and putting it down in the root and rhizome layers. So it's really in the soil that you're hoping to capture the carbon. But, it's a cycle with a lot of components in it. And when you look at, say, oyster restoration, you're realizing that, well, it really is all about balance, right? Because oysters produce carbon gases. They release CO2 in the formation of their shells. So they're actually net exporters of carbon into the atmosphere and into the ocean environment. So really, we can't do without oysters. We can't just eliminate some organisms that actually produce CO2. So really what it's all about is getting back to some kind of balance that we had when we had these extensive seagrass beds and when we had extensive oyster beds. And of course, NOAA is trying to return both of those organisms back into the marine environment. So it's all about the balance.
So when I do a design project at school, we add a layer. So let's say you're designing a park in Philadelphia. We add a layer of carbon credits. And we basically, there's a kind of a calculator of how many tons of carbon are sequestered by meadow, by scrub shrub, by wetland forest, by upland forest. And it's a rough calculator, but basically how many acres multiplied by this number gives you carbon that's being sequestered. Whether there's a market or not, the forest is working for us as we speak.
And that just shows you how important our forests are and the need to keep improving that and building more. Is that still an uphill battle?
You know, and salt marshes where they sequester a lot of carbon and they're really at risk.
Yeah. And it's who was it? I think it was Elon Musk, I think, that was offering someone, if they could come up with a great way to sequester, like he was offering a prize if you could come up with a great way to sequester carbon. And it's like, why don't you just take that money and improve our forests and improve
It's called photosynthesis. It takes carbon dioxide out of the air and puts it into plants and soil and gives off oxygen and makes food for all of our species.
Hey, Fran, can I ask a question to
Sure.
you and Bill and everybody?
Yeah.
So, this is a native plant show, right? So
Yes.
do native plants sequester more carbon than invasives?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's probably all dependent on what habitat you're looking at and what species you're looking at. But like right now in New Jersey, if a farmer abandons a field, it's only going to grow up in invasive species, right? Because it's mineral dirt, the pH is raised, they're earthworms chewing up organic material, and so it's going to get colonized by honeysuckle and Russian olive and all these things that we don't like because they provide structure, but they don't provide a food chain for insects, right? Because almost no insects live on any of them. So, but I mean, I think they're sequestering, they're growing fast, and the deer don't eat them as fast. So when you add deer into the equation, right, the deer eat all the natives, they don't eat all these other things as much. And so the other things take over and they sequester carbon. So what's the word I'm looking at? A service, right? An ecological service.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because one of the issues, and I know you all know this, is that like when I was at Fish and Wildlife, we're managing, 350,000 acres of land. Parks had 470,000 acres of land. I mean, we're blessed to have 1.5 million acres of open space in the state, actually more public open space than the state of Maine. But we don't have the resources to manage those lands correctly. And that was a struggle it's still a struggle for the agency. And I'm wondering, how we can, maybe creating this carbon market could give us the resources to actually create almost like this great cycle, right, of sequestering carbon and then getting more investment and spurring all of this, right?
And Emil had a great point and we actually discussed it on the last episode of The Buzz. When you look at it, there's all this study where it say this invasive may do this one function fantastic. Maybe right. This invasive sequesters carbon better than any of our native plants, but it's only doing one thing well instead of doing everything good. And we're native, like if it's not providing to the food web, if it's not doing a lot of these other things, you're creating an ecosystem that's a monoculture that has one function instead of 20 functions. So, I'm always torn when I see some of these studies that say this plant does this well, and there's studies with Phragmites that way. Phragmites holds the soil and it stops erosion, but it's not providing anything to the food web. And that's detrimental in my concern. So even if it sequester carbon better than anything else, it still lacks on so many other levels. I don't feel that that's a benefit
That's right.
just because it does that one thing well. But
Everything species specific. I mean, and then there's also short-term and long-term, you know, I mean, if we want to win the short-term battle, you know, in reducing CO2, atmospheric CO2, maybe some of the Phragmites stands and some of the Russian olive stands, maybe it's okay to have them around for a little while until we figure out a better way to restore them.
Yeah.
You know, but ultimately, you know, if you walk through a Russian olive forest on the Piedmont of New Jersey, there's no soil forming. I mean, you know, it's just amazing.
And there's no wildlife. There's no
There's
wildlife.
no wildlife. Well, you know, unfortunately, there's a couple of fruit-eating birds that spread the seeds all over the place, but there's no insect food chain.
Right.
But the most amazing thing is that in these stands of invasive species, you don't get soil. You get high pH, you get earthworms, you get mineralized dirt and worm casts, and the erosion is terrible.
Well,
even
that in
though the
itself,
land is
then
covered
that
by-
in,
even though the land is covered by plants.
that in itself means that that soil's not sequestering carbon either.
Right.
So there you have it, right? So
You
that's why we.
But that's, I mean, that's one example. There might be another invasive species. You know, for example, I'm sure you could find some non-native grass that if you took one of these fields and turned it into some sort of a grass meadow, and it might be a non-native grass, it probably could put down deep roots and sequester carbon. Of course, I'd always try to prefer the native warm season grass, because at least, you know, then you're going to have a food chain along with that structure and that other function.
awesome. All right. I hate to interrupt, but we're down to 10 minutes. So I want to make sure we all get to throw in what our favorite native plant is and our final thought. Emil, you got to do this before, unless you change your mind. All right. So, Bill, we'll start with you. Favorite native plant?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm gonna do Doug Talamy, and you know, I'm all about the food chain. I'm all about habitat, so I'm going with the oak. So I'll pick red oak, which is the state plant, the state tree of New Jersey. It houses more, it supports more insects, which builds more food webs than any other woody species.
Awesome. Marty, how about you?
Oh, he stole my thunder on that one. I would have gone with the oak because I'm a Doug Talamy
You
guy.
can have the oak too.
You know what I love? I love cardinal flowers.
Oh boy,
That is a great one.
They're really beautiful. But you know what I'm going to say? I love Phragmites. You know why?
Ooh.
Because it really got people into restoration.
Ooh.
So let's just put it that way. It's not a native, or some
Yeah.
people say it might be native, but let's say that. All right. Let's say, you know, it's just like the oil spills. There's a silver lining to it. It got people going. It was a first invasive that I ever dealt with.
Marty, a good part of my career is the Meadowlands converting Phragmites to Spartina, which
exactly
gave me a lot of nice income, which kept my wife talking to me.
But it really got people, it got people's juices flowing about restoration.
All right.
It did.
All right, Carl.
I think you're on mute, Carl.
Yeah, Carl, you mute it yourself.
You're on mute.
Okay.
All right. There you go.
Bill said it. He said the word Spartina. I'm going to have to go with
Good one.
Spartina alterniflora because,
perfect.
you know, Bill's wife is counting on him to make a living. And I must say that Spartina alterniflora has provided me with a career for many, many years.
It keeps our wives talking to us, right? That check coming in.
It's provided me a career. Without Spartina, Pinelands wouldn't be where we're at today.
Amen.
I have field collected the seeds. I have propagated Spartina. I have seen it grow through, I've taken care of it right through its nursery growing phase, and then I've popped them right into the ground on the edges of wetlands throughout New York and New Jersey. And I have to say, it's the plant that has helped me to become a restoration ecologist and a landscape architect. And I don't know what I would do without little old Spartina.
Amen, brother. Amen to that.
Or Sporobolus alternifloris.
But not speak of its new name.
They better not do that.
All right, Emil, your turn.
Well, I'm going to go with the single most fire adapted species in the world, which is the pitch pine.
Oh,
But the dwarf phenotype of the
Okay.
pitch pine,
Uh,
right?
Nice.
Which people who, there are people listening to this all over the world. I know there are all sorts of incredible destinations out there in the world that you have on your bucket list, but one of them should be the dwarf pine plains of New Jersey's Pine Barrens, because you can look from horizon to horizon, and in some areas the trees aren't more than 6 feet tall, and they're hundreds and hundreds of years old. And most of their biomass is 90%, 95% underground. They've survived literally centuries of fire every 5 to 10 years. You can't kill them. The only thing that can kill them is a bulldozer. And they have serotinous cones. The cones don't open up until they're heated to 140 degrees when a fire sweeps through. They basically are a tree living in a prairie, and they're the most incredible thing you've ever seen. So
I would agree with that. All right. So this is time of the show. We kind of give everyone a final thought. Just to summarize, you can plug something. You can bring up something that we hadn't touched on. You have a minute or two where the floor is yours, and you can say anything you want. Emil, I'm going to start with you.
anything I want.
Anything you want.
Uh-oh.
Oh, here it comes.
Notice I waited till the end of the show to give you that that option instead of the beginning of the show.
Well, this is not something that's going to save the world or save us from climate change or anything like that. But I think somehow, desperately, we need to reach people who think that destroying the environment, especially with monster trucks and off-road vehicles, is their right. Going off-road, and I mean, you can just watch any, sporting event and you see it, what's the word, romanticized in commercials, destroying sand dunes, destroying wetlands, destroying streams. It's just absolutely horrible what's going on right now. And the state of New Jersey is almost powerless to do anything about it because of a lack of personnel, lack of enforcement. It's dangerous. Marty could tell the story, I think, of when a conservation officer was run down by one of these people who was destroying habitat and severely injured. It's just a terrible problem. And there's just got to be a way to reach these folks and convince them that they're doing a crime against both humanity and nature. And it's just something that I wish I could figure out a way to make a bigger difference on that.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. Carl, I'm going to let you go next in case you need to run as soon as you go.
All right. Well, I'm going to go with bulkheads.
All right.
Bulkheads. Why bulkheads? Bulkheads replace natural shorelines. Bulkheads harden natural shorelines. My favorite plant, Spartina, lives on the edge of the waterway between land and water, right? And what does a bulkhead do? It replaces all of that. All of the functions that happen in that area between the that land-water interface, which is the most productive area on Earth, wherever you go. The land-water interface hosts probably the greatest diversity and has the greatest benefit to an enormous number of species, right? What's a bulkhead? A bulkhead is nothing more than a dam that replaces, that renders the land-water interface incapable of hosting that incredible diversity, richness, and abundance of species. So my pet peeve today, bulkheads.
Not to even mention the increased energy that it creates and what it does downstream of just replacing the erosion and the energy it creates and issues downstream, and how it destroys those areas that weren't bulkheaded. So it doesn't just replace there, it destroys as well. So
sending all the problems downstream.
Yes. Perfect. All right, Marty, your turn.
So I don't really have a pet peeve, but I will say this, that first of all, thank you for this. Really appreciate the
Oh, and
opportunity to
thank
be
you for
with
coming
you
on.
and everybody. It's a it's a real honor, actually. I just, I'm hopeful. I see a lot of good things coming out of DEP right now. The Assistant Commissioner Mazai put out or they're putting out regulations that's going to require green infrastructure and nature-based approaches. We have stormwater utilities that are going to be coming around. I mean, there are things that I think that could be done more so, ways to drive private capital into this so that government doesn't have to be the only one funding it. There are companies out there that want to do these things. They have environmental social governance. They're just looking for the projects, right? They're looking for the programs to help fund. So if we can kind of match these things up, I mean, there's also coastal resiliency issues that we're going to have to really focus on. I live at the coast. I've seen what happened during Sandy. I lived it. You know, maybe there's ways to take the wetland banking approach and create resiliency banks, you know, where, you know, if you're going to build at the coast and there's some way to fund a fund that where communities can you know, deal with these issues that we're going to be needing to deal with at the coast. So, you know, I'm hopeful. I see a lot of good things happening. We're finally getting it. We know how to put a dollar value to an oil duck now, thanks to a lot of people and Carl's and John Sacco's folks at the state. And we're doing really good things with the natural resource damage program that we started. And it's, you know, we have some big challenges, but I think with people like, you know, Bill and Carl and Emil out there and all the other groups working towards this, I really think it's, you know, we could tackle these problems. They're not insurmountable. And, you know, even the climate issue, I think we could tackle that, but with people working together. All right. And that's what I think, you know, I'm hoping that will occur in the next couple of years and we'll see some good progress.
Awesome.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, anytime. Thank you. Bill, go ahead.
All right. My quick message: restoration works. I've often said I never met a landfill I didn't like. Not that I like landfills, but when you close them and clean them up and restore them, and by the way, you have to clean them up under very strict laws, or Superfunds, or brownfields. What do you put back? You don't put back houses. You don't put back roads. You put back natural open space. So there's $4.2 trillion backlog worldwide on sites that can be restored. We know what to do. The genie's out of the bottle. We can restore areas and give wildlife back. They can give back something. So Harrison Avenue landfill is now this wonderful treasure for the city of Camden. Fresh Kills landfill, 2,200 acres. The worst thing on landfill is now going to be this great park that'll never be disturbed. And so restoration is fantastic, and it's a great economic driver, and it is we're so happy to have it.
Awesome. Thank you. Before I give my final thought, I just want to make sure I say thank you to everyone here. Today was a complete education. The brain power on this podcast today is just overwhelming, and I hope it's the same for our listeners. You have a lot to think about, and we could go on for hours, and this could probably spin off into 3 other rooted discussions. But this has been a lot of good, and the amount of restoration power between all of us here has been phenomenal. And it's my hopes is, and restoration really is the Band-Aid on the tail end, that we get to the point where we're, you know, as much more energy is being put on the preventative side than the fixing side, that we get to the point where we can prevent a lot of this instead of repairing all of our damage. But we've done a lot of damage over the years, and we're still learning about I'm sure there's something we have no idea that we're causing damage right now that we are, and we'll learn it 5-10 years from now, and we'll fix that. So, but this just proves that anything can be done. There's a lot of acres of land that has been restored because of the people that are here in this room and working together. And it wouldn't have happened if any of these pieces weren't here. It wouldn't have happened. So that's my final thought. And this is a first for me. I have to read my outro without my partner, Tom. I'm going on the record and saying, Tom, I don't like doing this without you. So
Miss you, Tom.
We missed him,
Yeah, I'm sorry you couldn't be here for this one. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed listening to our Rooted discussion, Government's Role in Restoration. For more information, you can visit Native Plants Healthy Planet website. We're going to post links for everyone here for their organizations where you can learn more. We want to thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. We also need to give a big thank you to RJ Comer for contributing brand new theme music to Rooted Discussion, Smothered. Make sure you listen or download his music at iTunes or Spotify or wherever you consume your music. You can follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Pinelands Nursery, and we have a brand new custom URL, Pinelands Nursery at YouTube. Don't forget about our question and comment line. Please call us at 215-346-6189. I will repeat that, 215-346-6189. Ask a question, leave a comment. If we pick your question or comment, we'll play it and answer it on a future episode of The Buzz. Let's not forget the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group. I know a lot of the gentlemen on this podcast are members. We're up to, I think, 300 members strong. The conversation's been going great, so we're going to keep that going. You can listen to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast directly at www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. I need to take a break. You can also check us out at Apple Podcast, and you make sure you leave a 5-star review for us there, or you can also tell us that we're too chatty, either or. Hit subscribe while you're there. You can also listen at Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you consume your podcasts. You can even ask Alexa to play the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast. I want to thank everyone. I am Fran. Thank you again for everyone for listening, and thank you to all of our guests. Thank you for being with us today. Coming up on the next Buzz, we will be talking about graminoids to follow up on the Forbes episode of the Buzz that we did last week. So until then, everyone, keep it native.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.